Well, kia ora koutou, ko Francois Barton te ingoa. Welcome to our second mental wellbeing webinar. I can see the numbers are starting to come through now. So welcome one and welcome all. Looking at the attendee list, I know some of you are long-serving and long-standing friends and supporters of the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum. So to you, welcome. And we've got a few new people on the call as well. So welcome, and I hope you enjoy the opportunity to connect with hopefully what will be what I know will be a provocative and engaging conversation today. The forum decided this year we wanted to commence some additional channels where we could share and connect with leaders and organisations across New Zealand in a way that was easy, but keep the conversation going on issues that were important. And the mental health and wellbeing at work topic is perennial. There's not a conversation I have with chief executives where, particularly in the current context, the role of people's mental health and mental wellbeing at work isn't on the agenda. The challenge, of course, is how do we actually tackle this challenging issue? So this is the second of these, is an opportunity for us to connect for a short, sharp injection of perspective and experience. And today is going to be absolutely one of those with my good friend and colleague and strategic partner and a well-known New Zealand expert, Dr. Hillary Bennett. Hillary, welcome.
Thank you.
So today, for those that know Hillary and the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum have been friends and partners really since our inception way back in 2010. But regarding today's topic around mental wellbeing at work and protecting mental wellbeing, Hillary was really the sort of conceptual engine room for the work we've developed over the since 2018. So we thought today what we'd look to provide the opportunity is for Hillary to sort of reflect on what's the body of work and the journey that Forum and Hillary with you have all been on since 2018 around unpacking the mental health at work series. Where have we got to? What's our reflections? What's Hillary's reflections of what she's seen in terms of how people have engaged with that work? Where are we at currently through the conversations and the work Hillary's doing with some of you, I know, and others? And then we'll break out at the end and then have a conversation around what we're starting to see maybe on the horizon as the next sort of avenue and the next horizon in this wellbeing conversation. We had Jason Van Schie from Flourish DX providing us some Australian reflections of what's happening here. Today's an opportunity to very much ground the conversation with Hillary's deep experience about what she's seen here in New Zealand. The slides, we have a slide deck here, and Hillary's actually developed this as a little bit of a takeaway resource, so you can grab some screenshots if you want, but we will be forwarding the slide deck after, so that's for everybody's reference at the end. We will be having questions. We'll look to have Hillary and I will have a little bit of an exchange. She'll take us through some conversation. When you've got questions, put questions through the chat function. You'll see the chat bot there is on the side. So if you've got questions, put those through there. We'll work our way through. We won't necessarily get to every question, but I'll do my best to focus on key themes so we can get to your questions in due course. Any major outstanding ones, we might come back to you in due course. So that's what we're here to do. So people know me well, Hillary. The last thing I want to do is hear me do more talking. So our journey on this topic started back in 2018 when my board said, Francois, we need to get on with this wellbeing thing. And I wasn't quite sure where to start because I knew there was this real range of how do we make sense of these issues. So that's where this work started. Maybe I'll just hand over to you now and take us through, what's your sense of that journey, where we went to and where we're at now.
Thanks, Francois, and thanks very much for the opportunity. And actually, I can vividly remember I was traveling down to Hamilton for some work, and you gave me a ring, and obviously on hands-free, we had a discussion, and I remember talking about the importance of trying to understand the causes of poor mental well-being in the workplace, as opposed to going for the yoga and the fruit. And so I've really valued the punt that the forum took on me to work with you to develop these things. So folks, I know that many of you may have heard me over the times of, because 2018 to 2040 is a long time. What I've tried to do today, particularly after I listened to Jason's webinar, a few weeks back, was, thinking, well, how can I add to the conversation? So really what I'm going to do is a bit of a reflective piece. I'm going to talk you through the resources and the work that the forum has done, that I've been able to work with them on. And then I'm going to step back and say, so what did this tell us? And then to sort of talk us through the journey and then go to where to from now. And I sometimes have challenges showing my slides on Teams, so I've got the help of Summer at the back. So Summer, if you wouldn't mind putting on my next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So 2018, where did we start? After that conversation, I went away and really had the challenge. I had this open sort of canvas to say, well, what would be helpful to CEOs and organizations in terms of trying to tackle this problem. And I landed in the place that maybe the most helpful thing is to help provide a sense-making framework rather than trying to be prescriptive around the work. So the first guide that came out in 2018, the Mental Health and Wellbeing, when these guides are all available still on the forum's website, really got my thinking to go to anchoring the sense-making around the mental health continuum and all the work we've done in the forum, and it still does inform all the work I do as well, is that some basic principles about mental well-being, and because people see it a little bit differently. And it really is basically, we all have mental health every day in the same way as we'll have physical health, that it's a state that enables a person to thrive or not. There are days when we're thriving, going okay, struggling or unwell, and it's on this continuum. But, it is universal. We all have it. It is subjective. It's different for each one of us, or slightly different for each one of us. It's very changeable and dynamic, and it's holistic. So those were some guiding principles that really we've hung on to dearly in the work that we've done. So the sense-making framework that emerged from that original work, you can see that the mental health continuum sits down the center of that diagram, not in words, but in colors. So the sense-making framework we're saying is the work of any organization in terms of ensuring that the work does not harm its people, both mentally and physically, and the opportunity to get people on the thriving end, has these 4 different approaches. There's the protect work, where you would have interventions that go in to assess the risk and design good work. You would have interventions or activities that build the capability of people to deal with challenges in life. But you'll notice that protect and foster are both proactive interventions. You're not waiting for people to be struggling on the mental health continuum or unwell before you do this work. And of course, there's also importance of doing what we call reclaim work, which is when people are going into that struggling side, what might your organization have in place to help maybe change the direction so they don't become really unwell, which is the domain of your employee assistance programs. Now, to my delight, and I'm sure the forum's delight, that sense-making framework has been used extensively. And I always do have a chuckle to myself when I see it embedded in various organizations' strategies or their documents, sometimes being acknowledged as forums framework, sometimes not. But that doesn't really matter, does it? It has always been a guidance to us to say, the work we need to do in this space is to play the full spectrum of that mental health continuum. We should be having in place things that are proactive and things that do support people when they might be challenged. We should be focusing on both the work and the individual. So that was our first bit of work. So if you go to my next slide, please, Summer, here's my reflections on that original work. First put out in 2018, then revised in 2021, but it was simply an update of that diagram because the original diagram didn't have the mental health continuum down the front. What we became aware of as we started working with model and talking to people and helping people make sense of their work was that across New Zealand and in the work I do in Australia, there was at that time very much reactive rather than proactive. People were understanding that when people were struggling or really were unwell, there was there was work for an organization to do. So that was the one thing. There wasn't much proactive work being done. That when we looked at the work that was being done, it was very individual focused as opposed to organizational focused. So what I mean by that is that we were, and I'm going to be a little bit facetious here, is that we were toughening up and fixing our people, and we were leaving the work unexamined to a large extent. This is early days, 2018, coming through to the early 20s, and their focus on individual interventions was, despite the fact that there is very little evidence around the effectiveness of those individual interventions. And I've recently come across some research that was done, well, it's a meta-analysis, but of research that was done out of the UK that's been published this year. And in their review of large amounts of research, sadly, that is still the case, that actually there's still a lot of focus on individual interventions and very little focus on what we would call organizational, trying to change the work interventions. I'll leave it there. I'm going to come back to that as an idea. So what we became aware of was that the protect space, which addresses the work rather than toughening up and fixing your worker, was what we would call the neglected approach. And we can question why that was the case, and there are a variety of different reasons. But I often say to people, I wonder whether that was because individual interventions, so mindfulness, stress management training, resiliency building, those activities, self-awareness, interventions, they taste and smell like well-being. If we're looking at trying to improve the mental well-being of people in our workplace, and then we say, well, we're going to support people to go on a mental health first aid program, or we're going to support them to do some mindfulness training, that does smell like we're doing good well-being work. And I'm not going to say for one moment that that work doesn't have a role to play. The forum's perspective on this, and my perspective as well, has always been, it's not a matter of right and wrong. It's a matter of, are we actually covering all our bases on this? Are we actually making sure we've got things going on both sides? So I think there are obviously other reasons. This latest work I've just been exposed to was also saying, individual interventions are a lot cheaper. Having said that, it always horrifies me at what organizations are prepared to spend on evidence on individual interventions where there's no evidence of any effectiveness long term. Anyway, so that's some reflection. So what our next stage, if I go to the next slide, then our next part of this journey was to say, actually, well, we need to understand this protect space better. That's a space that's been neglected. So the next work that we did in terms of the forum was the Protecting Mental Wellbeing line. So unashamedly, it was saying, we're going to focus in on the work, and we're going to provide a understanding of what the psychosocial risk assessment piece looks like. And we developed the workbook, which was known as Mental Wellbeing by Design, and many of you have been exposed to this, and many of you might have been using it to try and understand what might be the range of psychosocial risk. And we also published an article that was actually published in Safeguard as well, which was to try and understand the wicked challenge of psychosocial risk. So great move, gone from actually a sense-making framework to saying, actually, let's understand this protect space better. So if we go to my next slide, let me share some of my reflections on this. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in this space. I think that there's still a lack of understanding of the nature of psychosocial hazards and risks. And I think it's fundamentally important that we acknowledge that lack of understanding, because if we don't understand the nature of psychosocial risk, the ways you try and measure it, why you're trying to measure it, etc., are obviously going to be extremely limited. I had a call just a couple of days ago from an organization that said they were going to do a bow tie on a psychosocial risk, on social risk. And I said, well, we need to back up the truck here. Psychosocial risk is not a single risk. If you're telling me you're going to do a bow tie on psychosocial risk, could I ask you, would you ever do a bow tie analysis on physical risk? So just think about that for a second.
Mm.
No, you wouldn't.
Mm.
You'd do a bow tie on fatigue or confined spaces or working at heights, etc. So this is, I'm saying, so if we don't understand the nature of it and how we actually deal with it is actually going to be flawed. So what we need to understand is, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, so I don't want to sound like I'm being patronizing, that there are many aspects of work that have the potential to harm, and those are hazards. Whether they constitute a psychosocial risk is really dependent on the individual and the context. All right. So a psychosocial hazard, so with the potential to harm, could be linked to the way the task is designed or managed and organized. It could link to the inherent nature of the task, like emergency services. It could be linked to the equipment, the work environment, etc. And obviously there are whole social factors that are also potential psychosocial risks, or there are hazards, potential risks. So there's a broad range of hazards. Whether they constitute the risk is, again, dependent on individual, because remember, our principles of mental health is that it's objective, one of the principles. So, you know, workload for different people will mean different things in terms of risk in their mental health. So I've got a couple more reflections if we move on to the next slide. Going back to the point I've just made, you know, psychosocial risks are very subjective. They're also seldom directly observable and measurable. And there's not always that very clear relationship between task and effect. And this is one of the things I'd love you to take away from today's discussion, which is we need to look at psychosocial risks different to physical risks. An example I often use is noise. You know, if someone says noise is impacting on my hearing, harming my hearing, you know, we'd say, yeah, I get that, because we know noise impacts on hearing, and I can go and measure the level of noise in the work environment, and if it's above a certain level, I can implement some controls depending on how much money I've got in my packet. I can go to eliminating or minimizing, etc. And thereafter, really, all I need to do is measure that the controls are still working. Whereas psychosocial risk is so different. And here, talking to some of my next bullet points, is that they are present in all types of work. There's no work that would not have a potential psychosocial hazard connected to it, but they'll vary across organizational levels, functions, and operational teams. They very much depend on the nature of the work done. So when I think about the work we need to do in the Protect space, we really need to acknowledge that work is our currency. And so we need to say, it doesn't make sense to just say we're going to identify the psychosocial risks across the whole organization as if everyone's work was the same. We have to say, in our organization, we have different types of work, and what does psychosocial risk look like across those different types of work? And sometimes the risk will impact, you know, organizationally wide. One of the common ones I hear that I'm sure many of you are familiar is inadequate IT, you know, and sometimes it's more around maybe a team, because we maybe have a manager who doesn't have particularly strong emotional intelligence and is not really supportive, you know, and sometimes it will be very task focused. It might be, you know, that we don't have the tools to do the work we need to do, and that's frustrating and it causes, you know, some level of stress. So one of my reflections is that if we're going to do good work in the Protect space, we need to step back and say, let's not assume just because we understand physical risk, we understand psychosocial risk, and let's understand some of the complexities that sit within that mix. So if I go into my next slide, I think I've got one more still on some reflections on this. There we go. Thank you. The focus has been, when we go into the, sorry, let me go back. So the Protect space, I've sort of been looking about psychosocial risk assessment. And if you look at our original sense-making framework, we say there quite clearly that the Protect work is about identifying, you know, risks to people's mental health, but it's also about designing good work. My reflection is that people gravitated very quickly to the psychosocial risk assessment piece and came to the party a bit later around the link between that and the design of the work. So, going forward, and I'll talk to this in a minute, is actually they are both equally important in the piece. And we haven't paid and tried to understand the design piece, I think, as well as we could. So why did we gravitate to the psychosocial risk? I think there were a couple of things there. I think it was June 2021, the ISO 45003 guidelines came out, very strong sense of risk. We saw across in Australia, a whole range of all different states identifying some regulatory, codes of practice, etc., in terms of that. So psychosocial risk became very much flavor of the month. And work design didn't get quite the same level of attention. And really, what I'd like us to think of is psychosocial is simply a diagnostic. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's actually, if we're looking at improving well-being and we want people to thrive, the goal actually is to design better work. The psychosocial risk assessment process is a wherewithal to enable us to design better work. So, designing better work, it's actually, and I love this word, I use it quite a lot, it's about crafting work in a way that better supports people's well-being. And it really is about designing out your harmful work, your harmful factors, and designing in your protective factors. Now, that is something that the work in the forum's done, has been very clear about the harmful and protective factors. And I think I can fairly confidently say that that's not a strong lens that I've seen across many other jurisdictions. So if you go and look at the work that's been coming out of Australia around risk assessment, the voice around protective factors is not as strong as the voice around understanding and minimizing, eliminating harmful factors. And I'd just like to reflect here and say, sometimes the harmful factors are simply the name of the game. I mean, shift work is a known psychosocial hazard. All right. Don't forget, it's only a risk depending on how I subjectively respond to that situation. But, if you're a nurse, if you're working in a 24/7 operation, that's just the name of the game. So what we need to be doing equally well as well is saying, well, if that's the name of the game, then how do we understand those protective factors? Some work that that the forum's been doing with some ACC funding and working in manufacturing was a real a wake-up call for me in many ways, and I was a little bit shocked that it had to be a wake-up call for me. But the guys were working with some operators on an assembly line production, and I had assumed that shift work or unsociable work hours would be one of their key psychosocial hazards and risks that they would identify. And they pushed back and they said, you know what, we couldn't survive without a shift work. It is our protective factor. That's their words. They said this is actually what enables us to do our lives. So you have to be really careful that we don't go in with assumptions around what might be these risks. And I'm going to do a little bit of a connected dot back into what I see happening in many Australian operations, where when they go to identify what might be the harmful factors, it's very often done by people that we would say live and work as imagined land, not work as done land. In other words, it's your health and safety managers, your health and safety functions, your HR functions often, who are from a distance trying to assess what might be the psychosocial hazards or risks for these people. And I just think that's not feasible. So where we've gone from the sense-making framework, we've gone into looking more into the protect space. So where did we go to next in terms of, the work that the forum has been supporting? So if we go on to our next slide, we then did go into job redesign, and I can't claim any claim to having developed this work, because Renee did a really good piece around the next guidance material came out. Let's try and understand this redesign work. The diagram I've got on there, and I know it's going to be quite small, but you'll get the slides, is some work that comes out of the Committee of Economic Development in Australia. And basically, they were looking at the range of different interventions in terms of effectiveness of the interventions level versus the difficulty of interventions. And you can see there on the right-hand side, it says start here, and you'll work your way through. Well, I've put a red arrow there onto the job redesign, and I just wanted to make this point, that our next sort of thinking was actually this is about redesigning the work as much as it is about identifying harmful factors. This is not easy work. It is probably one of your most effective interventions if we can go on this research, but it's also maybe one of your most difficult things. So the next thing we really need to get our heads around is then what does effective good work redesign and look like? So those of you who are interested in that, you could go get the forums guide. I also had a little article published in the Safeguard, I think it came out February this year, with some other thinking around better work design. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to share with you this wonderful imagery that I picked up with at the end of last year. The University of New South Wales offered a certificate, an online certificate for psychosocial risk assessment. And I thought, well, I better make sure I'm still ahead of my game here. So I signed up to do it. The facilitator, who I knew from working on the ISO 4503 work, he said, think about an ice cake. And he says, it looks delicious, but he says, when you cut into the cake and you taste it, if you haven't got the ingredients right, if you haven't baked the cake at the right temperature, if you haven't put in your baking paper, etc., etc., you still have, excuse my language, you still have a shit cake. So he was using this imagery, and I think it's such a good imagery for us to take, is that those individual interventions, although they are valid and so though they're important, we have to say they're pretty much the icing on the cake at one level, because if we don't get that protect work done properly, if we don't understand the work, then actually at the end of the day, we've just got a very nice ice cake, but it's not going to be particularly nice tasting. So I would say that this, one of the things that I have done in my changing, so the original work in the forum was mental wellbeing by design. I actually now don't refer to that as mental work by design. I actually think it's about better work by design is a much better name for that work, because it is about the work. So mental wellbeing, and look, hands up, that was my work, I did it. Really focus on what is the mental well-being. And we were looking at that stage thinking, how do we influence mental well-being? We're still trying to do that. There's no doubt about it. But what I'm really wanting to say is what we want to signal is actually we want to focus on the work. And so better work is absolutely crucial for creating, a mentally healthy workplace. It provides your highest level of protection against minimizing hazards and risks, etc. You can read those points on that slide. So think of, we've gone from a sense-making framework with 4 different approaches. We've gone to understand the protect work in a better. We realized that we had a very psychosocial risk assessment lens on that, starting to understand the importance of the design piece coming through. And now we've gone to, actually saying, maybe we didn't even get the terminology quite right. Maybe it is around better workplace. So if I go to the next slide, I'm nearly finished, and then we can open up for conversations. Better work design sits within the protect space. It's more than a psychosocial risk assessment, although it uses a psychosocial risk assessment as part of its diagnostic process. It's about crafting the work. It involves designing out and building in protective factors. So if we move on to the next slide, what I want to share with you, and this is really just where I've landed based on my experiences and based on my understanding over the last while, is that what will be more helpful is to think of better work by design as a process. And I'll talk to this very briefly. The first part of that process is organizational readiness. And what I mean here is when you CEOs and executives, authorizers of this work, really understand what psychosocial risks are, what they're doing, what the implications of better work by design piece. It's not just to get your critical risk register sorted out. It is about designing better work. So there is some, and we have missed a trick, I think, in that we haven't spent enough time really ensuring that the organizations, executives, decision makers, authority, people who are going to sign off on wellbeing activities really understand the nature of the beast. Then we're going to go into what I'm going to call the phase 2, the discovery phase, which is where you go and you do your classic psychosocial risk assessment. Now, bear in mind, there are a whole host of ways that you can do this. If you go with Flourish DX, they're going to do survey type work. If you go into the Australian phase, they've got the People of Work survey. There's a whole lot of stuff. If you come into our space in New Zealand, we're going to go some of us are going to go much more to a facilitated workshop type post. But you know what, you would need to make the decision as to who's your target audience, as to what would be the most appropriate diagnostic tool to do in phase 2. But really what you're doing is you're focusing on the work. I think we've also missed a trick in that when we collected the data from some of the original mental wellbeing by work design piece work we did, is that we didn't really acknowledge the importance of the sense-making phase prior to going into redesigning work. So the sense-making phase would be saying, actually, of these factors that we've identified, how often do they happen? What is the severity of the impact? And what is the duration that people's exposed to things? So really making sense of the data that comes out of phase 2, the diagnostic, the classic psycho risk assessment type work, before you go into then saying, okay, let's look at redesigning the work. And all I'm suggesting in the redesigning work, once you've made sense of what you're going to focus on, some of the stuff will be quick fixes and you just get on and do it. Some of the things that you tease out in that diagnostic phase might require some experts around. Let's say it's fatigue. You might say, well, actually, we don't understand fatigue, but there are other people who understand it really well. Let's get them in to help us. Some of them may be in the complex space, and you need to be saying to your people, actually, I hear what you're saying. That has the potential to impact on mental health for this particular group doing this work. We don't quite understand it. We might need to probe. We'll get you involved in trying to do it, but don't expect an answer tomorrow. So I think what we need to do is a much better job of managing expectations and understanding the process in terms of that job design. So this is just a very simple way of me trying to make sense of what I've seen in the last while, saying, it's way more than just psychosocial risk assessment. It's a design of good work. It's actually a process fundamentally important to get your execs and seniors, leaders, and your health and safety leads really understanding the work doing. And here is my last point on this model, and then we'll open it up, is to say, actually, I'm seeing organizations willing to go into phase 2 and do the psychosocial risk assessment diagnostic work. I'm not seeing the same level of commitment to the time taken required to do good job design work. And if you go with my point that this is not about just assessing your risks, this is about designing better work. If we don't do phase 4, which is the design piece, really well and understand some of the complexities in that, at the end of the day, we'll have a meaningless list of psychosocial risks on a critical risk register, which might tick the box in an audit, but it's not really going to achieve long-term gain. And Francois, I think I've just got maybe one more. I think I'll miss my next. Go to the next slide. I'm not going to talk to it very much. It's just that in terms of the work, based on some of the work I did originally as a forum, facilitated workshop. We've also got an online version with the thanks to the help of the forum. And also I have recently developed a card sort to be used where the sort of more when you've got literacy issues or, and where you've got people with different languages. So go into the next slide. So and there are different ways. It's not be prescriptive here, you do, or you can all choose how you go into that. So I think I've got one last slide, and then Francois and I can have more of a conversation. So here's some principles that I would make you think it'd be helpful for you to take away from today is take account of the organizational context. Really important, what you can do, what you can be expected to do as a small organization as opposed to a large organization is very different. The ISO 45003 guidelines are absolutely clear on that too, where they're saying, yes, we need to understand what risk means for people's mental health, but what you can be expected to be doing and how you do it will be quite different. Focus on the work, especially those work factors that have the greatest impact on well-being, all right? Don't just feel the obligation to protect people from harm. Get out of the opportunities to help people thrive. Whatever you do, ensure that it is actually that workers take the lead. No one knows the work and its impact of the work better than themselves. There are people doing it. And maybe this bullet point should be at the top, which is, leadership is key here. If leaders are committed to actively supporting the process, and therefore they need to understand it's not just a psychosocial risk assessment that's necessary but not sufficient. And here, and I say this cautiously and hesitantly, but don't shy away from the challenges. What I'm seeing at the moment, when people do, with all the best intention that will go into the design piece, that it feels to me that sometimes it's tinkering around the edges and they're shying away from the significant challenge, which is actually just the way we've done the work fundamentally needs to change. Now, I know that sounds scary, and I'm going to say, let's put that in the complex space. You do not have to do this overnight, but you need to be up for saying, actually, what we might find out through this process is the way we've been doing it can no longer be sustained, and we have to think of different ways. Otherwise, I think we'll land up just doing very minor little tweaks and changes that might relieve some frustration, but really don't have the major impact on well-being. And the whole point of all of this actually is to continue to improve work. We spend a large amount of time in our workplace, and I'm just going to end off with a quote out of this research, that article I found. It was published in the States last week. Interestingly enough, because I don't normally go to the States for much of my guidance. But they just said work-related psychosocial hazards on the verge of surpassing many other occupational hazards in their contribution to ill health, injury, disability, direct and indirect costs, and impact on business and national productivity. The reason we do this work is to ensure that the work we're doing does not harm people both physically and mentally. And of course, don't forget, there's a real loop back into safety as well. So, folks, I hope that has been helpful. It really has been a bit of going on the balcony around the work that I've been doing with the amazing support from the forum. I hope there's been a little bit of catalyst there for some thinking and some provocation in terms of what you're thinking. But I'm handing back to Francois to, I think, ask me a couple of questions.
Yeah, well, look, thanks, Hillary, and that's the last 6 years of our life. You just rattled through there. Summer, maybe we can just drop the slide so we can I can see Hillary a little bit more closely. One of the things that sort of struck me, particularly on that last slide, Hillary, was this idea of context, organizational context, and one of the realities I'm seeing talking to organizations and chief executives around the country right this minute with cost of living. What one CEO referred to it, just the shoutiness of society at the moment. There's a post-COVID fatigue, not a clinical description, but there's a whole bunch of that sort of social fatigue. So if we go to the mental health continuum from an organizational perspective, there's a sense and a feeling that there's a lot more people struggling at the moment than maybe has historically been the case, or certainly maybe a higher degree of sensitivity to that. In which case, we are kind of feeling like we're in a more reclaimed space, yet also, your appropriate challenges, we also need to be thinking about how do we get up into that protective space. What's your observation, either from your own experience and just from your own expertise? How do organizations juggle that? Because organizations are under massive financial constraint at the moment. So if I see someone bleeding in front of me, I need to kind of do something about that as well as the readers. So what's your observation around that balancing?
Well, here's another image that I picked up when I did that New South Wales University course, and it's a great image, and it says people bring their lunchbox to work. So whether people are struggling because, cost of living and, there's a whole host of things happening within our communities and society as a whole, today being a good example of, protests around the country, etc. So people bring into their lunchbox. But I suppose what I'm saying to the audience today is you can't be held responsible for what's happening in people's personal lives, okay, what they bring in their lunchbox. But you know what? You can be responsible for what they take in their lunchbox home, because don't forget that lunchbox goes home. So yes, I'm saying that there is absolutely place for an organization to do some good reclaim work, but again, be critical of what you're prepared to do. Go to the reclaim work, which is actually evidence-based. And I would go back, and this is my bias. There's some very good work being done through the Mental Health Foundation work, through the 5 Ways to Wellbeing, evidence-based work around what helps us, cope with some challenging times. So I think we do need to do some, so it's not an either or, Francis, absolutely there's work to be done. But what I'm afraid I'm seeing is that a lot of the work done in the reclaim space smells and tastes like well-being, but it's actually got no evidence of improving. And I think I've said this in a previous case, one of the most valuable things an organization can do to support the well-being, and this is evidence-based work coming out from research out of Oxford University, which says, provide your people with financial literacy training. Might be the most effective bit of well-being training you can do. So in that space, but what I'm saying is, yes, go away. You do need to do that work. But if you want long-term sustainable change to create a mentally healthy workplace, you have to do the work in the Protect space as well. But don't think you have to do it all over the next 6 months.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that was going to be so look, I think that's really helpful in that reclaim restorative space, like that financial literacy. Again, I'm hearing that come through a lot of organizations realizing how they can just actually support their people with just dropping a little bit of that anxiety. But I like the 5 Ways to Wellbeing, and the beauty for that, folks, is that's all free. There's a ton of resources on the Mental Health Foundation, and you can turn that from not just being a Mental Health Week campaign, that can actually be a program of work throughout the whole year. But the other piece, though, I think what I'm also seeing at organizations at the moment is there's massive cost-induced work transformation and work redesign going on for a whole bunch of different reasons. So have you got any clients that are sort of in that space, or you're seeing any situations where there is a cost out productivity imperative to change work that could be repurposed, or just nice with a Tai Chi focusing of shift of focus?
So interesting. I mean, if you go to, it's the work coming out of the World Health Organization in terms of what are the key psychosocial hazards, they identify organizational change. So, and any transfer, any redesign is a major big change, isn't it? As a major psychosocial hazard. So I think that whether the change has been driven through, what we've been seeing in the public sector have been told to cut back, or whether it is because the economy is slowing down and you're needing to, to do some structural changes to keep yourselves going. And I know I'm being glib and maybe not using, language that maybe resonates with everybody around that. I would say acknowledge that the design and redesign process in and of itself might be impacting on people's well-being, and so be cautious about how you go about doing that, and then be also aware that as a result of some of that change that you've introduced, whether you've now got people doing jobs that are different to the ones that they were signed up for, or whether you've got people now doing 2 jobs instead of 1, that you've actually introduced another set of psychosocial hazards into that space. So be reflective of the impact of those changes on people's mental well-being. I think should be, just part of the agenda for that work.
Because I think, another sort of, I guess, leadership balancing act or anxiety, I think, can be a concern that there's sort of, we're opening up a Pandora's box of organizational change and transformation beyond what we've actually got capacity or bandwidth to be able to deal with at the moment. So you talked earlier around that leadership commitment or leadership understanding at the front end. I mean, if you were to sort of think about 3 or 4 sort of principles or no mindsets, where would you say, like, if I'm going to finish with some questions around advice you might have for well-being leads, in trying to engage the top table, as well as for leaders engaging maybe better questions. But if you've got for a leader to be reflective, what do I need to be in a state of before it's actually sensible for me to take the next step into this space? Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question, Francois. I think I think there are a couple of things. I think that to be curious, to really keep your mind open to what the changes may look like, and that you don't know the answers to all of that. And I think then also to be really intentional, that intentional in terms of the long-term goal, which is to improve work so that people have experienced better mental health as a result of their work, as opposed to intentional to say, I've got a critical risk register and I know my psychosocial risks. Actually understand your goal is to actually to improve the work, and then be willing to question and be curious and to be open-minded to what might be the possibilities. Not an easy call, but yeah.
And actually, it's been okay to wait until you're at that point.
Absolutely. I think that's one of my key messages to any of you who are being keen to do some of this work is, and this has been my maturity and my growth in this space, from really say, oh, let's go out and identify hazards and understand people work. Actually say, hang on, put on the brakes here. If you've got a large organization, maybe start working with your high, where there might be some high risk groups. And then really start to get some design and some change going through. And this is why it's important to see that the protect work is not just about identifying the risks, it's actually about designing the good work. So if you understand it's about designing good work, then you know that it's not going to happen overnight. You know that some of the stuff's going to come out, is going to be in that complex space, and we're going to need we don't literally even understand what we're dealing with, but at least you've got that on the radar. So be patient is another characteristic I think we need to have, and maybe also to live with a little bit of ambiguity.
Yeah, I think if I'm growing. I'm getting a reduced sense that the conversation about mental health or mental well-being, even if we don't get to the better work into that, has less. There's certainly a level of stigma or anxiety, but my sense is that has appreciably shifted. And over the 6 years we've been working on this together,
absolutely,
my sense is that's a major shift. But I do still
shift.
I do think that uncertainty, and especially in an environment where I think the volatility for senior leaders around what we do is challenging.
Yeah.
And I think the idea of starting something where you're opening, asking questions, and you're inviting questions on something you don't know how you can resolve. My thoughts are, I'd be interested in that actually it's okay for an organization to say we're not there yet.
Yeah.
Actually, we've got some other parts of the ship we need to get ready or steady before we move there.
Yeah.
I've
actually said, Francois, to some organizations that if you're not ready to do this work in a meaningful way, and really, the goal is to really look at how the work is impacting on people, I say to them, don't do it. I think you could actually be more harmful by doing it with not totally understanding and just trying to understand what are harmful factors. And I know in timing, you had mentioned early on, we'll go back to the Australian context. And I'm seeing a lot of that in the Australian context, where they've got regulation. In fact, it's understanding, I might be wrong this, but my understanding currently is the only countries that have got this, the psychosocial mandatory in their regulations is Japan and Australia. So there's this huge surge out there to try and understand, and they've got some very good guidance out there, and they've actually got some extremely good guidance out there on the job design piece, but I don't know that they're connecting the dots that well. So when I work with Australian organizations, they'll be very strong about, we're doing our survey type psychosocial risk assessment. We know what the risks are, and then the conversation ends there, because actually they're not connecting it to having to do some other work. So regulatory frameworks can drive certain behaviors to tick the box, rather than really understanding actually what they're getting engaged in.
Yeah, and I mean, I've never had a problem with the idea of a level of regulatory tension and regulatory heat being part of how we affect change at a national level. And I think, the forum's been quite public in its current concern around the lack of an absence of that heat regarding a whole lot of classic health and safety issues. The well-being one, I'm a little bit less envious of that Australian heat on this one, because I do wonder if all of the areas of the health, safety and well-being agenda the well-being one, to have a checklist tick box element compliance, well, we've done it, move on, next, feels to me a more problematic area. So this is one area where actually I think a softer approach, a softly, not soft approach from the regulator doesn't feel inappropriate to me.
And again, it goes back to fundamentally understanding the nature of harmful factors related to work, which is actually they are changeable and they're subjective. So do we not get better quality data with the stance that the forum took early days, which is going for conversation piece around this rather than survey methodology? And also the thing is that some of those surveys coming out of Australia are restricted by the size of the organization. Some of them are saying, this is only valid to you if you've got an organization of 250 people. Well, there are lots of organizations in New Zealand that are not going to have that number of people. So, I think the guidance coming out of Europe early days in this thinking was a participative approach and dialogue based was the guidance at that point in time.
The idea of work as currencies are really interesting. Just FYI, everyone, I understand there's been a few challenges with the chat function. So if there are questions you've got, throw them in Q&A. So apologies if that's been an issue for anybody. This idea of work as currency, Hillary, I mean, the idea of all of these things being an outcome of work's been a long-standing principle for the firm. We actually had the team from Mitchell Services over at Eden Park recently, and Josh Bryant was engaging us all was great. Humor around the work they've done applying the HOP principles, which will be familiar, I'm sure, to a lot of people here if they've not looked them up. Human organization performance principles, but also then his translation of that to use of the 4Ds. And I'm thinking about 4Ds as a way of sort of creating a different platform to engage with people about work as the currency and about challenge or sense making or change challenges. Maybe just any quick thoughts around, again, if we are curious and cued into listening to what our people start coming through that HOP principle lens and 4Ds, whether there's some stuff in there that could be useful?
Well, 4Ds is just a really nice framework around, questions to ask. But and some other work that I've come across recently is a guy called Sam Goodman from the States, who's got this book, which I think the title is fantastic, folks. It's called Let's Make Safety Suck Less. And he talks about operationally curious questions, which are very aligned to, human organizational performance or potential, whichever one we go with. And so that I think to be operationally curious around aspects of work that impact on people's mental health as opposed to their safety would be a really good way to have those conversations, and to equip your frontline leaders and your people leaders to know that actually be curious about the fact that emails are being sent late at night. Be curious about how much work people have got in their pipeline that they feel that they just feel so pressured that even if they've got this task finished, they've got about 10 others. Be curious about their work. And honestly, I think that would be one of the highest or one of the best engagement strategies with your people. When you genuinely show interest in their work and its impact on them would be one of the most effective leadership strategies you could be. So those principles, I think we can take into the wellbeing space, but it's really with the lens on how is your work impacting on your mental health, not just your physical safety.
Yeah. Well, we've managed to actually get a question through, so let's go for it. So a question here from Margaret around any examples or an example you've got around a common work design issue. What's any frequent flyer work redesign issues and any insights on some redesign solutions of how it was tackled?
So the question is where it's worked well?
Or have you, what's a common work design issue you're seeing in numerous situations?
Working with a group, and this is through the Forum's ACC Manufacturing Project, working with a group of frontline operators who identified that the most harmful factor was that their tools go missing, and the frustration and the breakdowns getting slowed up and they cost that. And so I then helped make sense, was back with the guys working with some sense, trying to decide which of these factors they wanted to focus on. This is the one they wanted to focus on. And I kept trying to get them to think through different ways. They kept pushing back, saying, no, that wouldn't work. We tried that. And eventually so with perseverance on my part, eventually got a little bit of a kink in terms of where they wanted to go. And it was as simple as saying, well, maybe we do a stock take of your tools. And we say, anyway, long story short, from the redesign work, the sense-making part is important. You need to go to look at the pieces that need to be changed, that really resonate with the group, not the ones that you as the person removed from the work think are the important ones. You need to go back and say, this is where you landed and which of these things are really important. And then you have to sometimes work really hard to try and get them to engage in what the redesign piece might look like. But in that particular piece, they went out feeling that that was a manageable bit of rework design, that it would make a huge difference to their day-to-day life. So what are some of the principles there, if I go reflective, which is make sure that you don't choose as the health and safety manager or the exec or as what should be the redesign work. You need to actually get the guys involved in what is redesigned. And then you need to know that they won't just have the solution straight away. So there goes my point. The design work, you need to allocate time for it. It's not going to happen in half an hour. You know, you've got to allocate time for people to think about it and come up with solutions. You might need to bring some experts in it. So don't underestimate how much time the design work. Now, for some of you, you might be thinking, oh, well, that makes it too difficult for us to do. Start small. You don't have to redesign the entire universe overnight. Get some runs on the board and where they can see they've actually had an impact, and then you'll get some more things. But so principles, don't make sense of it. You know, get the people to make sense of it themselves, and then give them the time to really think through what success or what a good outcome might be.
Thanks, Hillary. Got a question from Jerry. A lot of the psychosocial risk protective factors are also parts of good leadership. And is there an opportunity to be talking more around good leadership and engagement versus mental well-being alone, which is often less well understood? So sort of bringing both our HR and our health and safety functions together and thinking about language being important.
Yeah, well, I know, and I'm actually going to beg and borrow on the guidance on mentally healthy work comes from the World Health Organization, and in what we call foster and reclaim, they call promote work, and they say one of the most valuable things any organization can do in terms of creating a mentally healthy workplace is to provide leadership training to their people leaders on what their role is in terms of supporting people to thrive. So that doesn't say this is a mental health first aid program. This is a leadership program. It's what is your role and your responsibilities, where the obligations and opportunities for you to demonstrate good leadership. And so the discussion is not so much on psychosocial risk assessment per se, but it's actually what your role as a leader. So I think there's a very strong leadership piece in the storyline as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think language is so important. And I mean, I was having a conversation with a group just the other day, and the speed with which we went into the fixing and toughening up the individual. Whereas if we could bring it back to a leadership space, I think we would have held it in quite a different position.
Right, so if I can add to that, when language is
please.
important, just very briefly, that's why I have personally moved from what I originally did with the forum around mental wellbeing by design, because I think the mental wellbeing there was still a little bit of a stumbling block. Whereas now, if you go in and I talk about I'm doing better work by design, it does remove some of the stigma that we sadly still have around mental health.
Question here from Sarah, might make this the last one, Hillary, from Sarah Jane. Any tools being developed to assist with that leadership training, or maybe any development programs or providers?
For that leadership training?
Yeah, for any, I think, just more in this general sense, what sort of any areas we can look to for that type of leadership development? Join the forum, of course.
Yeah, you join the forum. I was just going to say, I should unashamedly say, actually, it is work I do, and it's work that other people like Umbrella do some really good work in this space. So I think there are a few credible consultancies in New Zealand that do this work in a very considered way. I haven't got the names of programs, but I really would encourage, whatever you do, is that it's based on good evidence and it's got some, some conceptually sound things. And again, those of you who know me, I do have an ex-academic background, so I still like to make sure that the stuff we're doing is good. And so, there are a few, and Bretta being one of them, ourselves being another, where the work we do in this space is actually guided by good theory and evidence, but put in a very practical way.
And as my good friend Jared Vaughan, who might be known to anyone that works in the wellbeing space, particularly around farm strong, he always says the beauty of anchoring to the evidence, Hillary, is you tend to agree. We tend to agree when we anchor to the evidence. And I know Dougal and the team at Umbrella, do good work. So good question. Thanks, Sarah. Look, Hillary, I think we've come to the end of the time, so I think we might just round it up there. Thanks so much. It's always lovely to see you, and I think it's also just, for me, this has just been a really cathartic memory of the amount of work we've built up over the last 6 years. And I think if I look at where Australia is now and where they were when we started, I think we've been ahead of the game. So it's been a really proud piece of work for me and the opportunity to work with you. And I know it's been appreciated by our friends and colleagues out in across New Zealand. So look, thanks very much. Thanks everybody else. Sorry, you got any final?
I just wanted to say my thanks to the forum for giving me the space to do this work. It's been the highlight of my career. I always say to people, at 67, I should be retired, but there's still work for us to do. I think the work that we did and with the support of the forum has been given us the opportunity to be leaders in the space. So thanks to you guys too.
Nice,
Mutual recognition agreements. Yeah,
I like it. And look, and Joe, there's a question there. Any other questions we've got? Feel put them through. We might pen back some responses later and we'll include that in the feedback note. So Hillary, thank you. To everyone else, we've got a third session coming up on 26 June at 1:30. We've got a friend and colleague of mine from Perth, Western Australia, Graham Wright, and Graham's going to be talking to us, really digging into sort of the physical elements of well-being, so physical health and well-being, so bringing quite a different perspective to help round out what we're doing in this conversation. So in the meantime, stay curious, hold the ambiguity, and keep work as your currency. I think that's what I'll take out of your call, Hillary.
Great.
Thanks, everyone. Hillary, go well.
Okay.
Everyone have a good day. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.